you said earlier that you're not inclined to necessarily prove the or disprove the existence of race, though I know in our communication you've said, surprise, surprise, it doesn't really exist, right? But you do lean into the recognition and awareness of the fact that what most people presume about race is wrong. So tell me more about that. We're connected on Twitter. I've seen you. I've called on you a lot. I've taken advantage of the fact that you know all this stuff that I don't. People talking about sickle cell. People talking about all of these things which they attach to race, including one's ability to jump higher or run faster. Um, and yeah, just feel inspired to enter the conversation from whatever direction.
Yes, I mean, obviously it's complex. We're talking about that before, and you have to sort of talk about how you conceptualize race to talk about whether or not it has utility, right? So if you conceptualize it incredibly simple, if race is a demarcation between skin color, right? And everyone on the side on one side of the line is white and everyone on the other side is black. It doesn't matter where you're from, then okay, like that's race, and you have something, and it could be informative, right? If again, like I was making a joke, but if I said if I only had one bottle of sunscreen left, I'd give it to a redhead, right? So sure, right? Like it's going to tell you something about how dark you are, how much resistance to the sun you have, but I mean that's not going to give you any answers about like where your ancestors come from, right? So you can have a phenotypic race, right? White and black based on some color of skin. Of course, we're going to get tan in the summer and maybe we're going to cross over sometimes, but fine, right? But the idea is that there's something out there that has utility like that for sunscreen, and actually a lot more utility, and is a strong reflection of who your ancestors were for the last 10,000 years or 20,000 years or some amount of time. And that I think is what's not true, right? So you can't have both. You can talk about your ancestry and you can talk about separating us by how we look, but trying to do both, it just doesn't work very well. And I think why it doesn't work is actually really interesting. And we didn't really know why it doesn't work. What's kind of cool about Lewontin and these guys is, to be fair, and the HBD group, they don't like these guys. And they have one fair point, that these guys kind of guessed. They kind of guessed that subspeciation in humans doesn't exist. And they were kind of right, but they didn't really know. And I think it's in the last 10 years that we've really learned this, right? So I think it is something that it's fair to not assume it, but we've basically learned that ancient humans and like ancient DNA, whenever we find it, it always shocks us, right? It never matches really the modern people that come from that place. And so there's an example, there's a cave in Morocco. They find some bones from there, and they estimate they're 10 to 12,000 years old, right? So this is obviously a long time ago. This is before Christ, before Islam, before the Arabs got there, before all of that stuff. But like 40% of the DNA, its closest match, and of course it's pretty ancient DNA, so it's not going to match exactly. Its closest match is to a group of people, is to actually some other less ancient DNA that's like 3,000 years old, and it's in the Near East, right? So the Middle East. And then the other half of the DNA, its most similar match to any DNA we have now, is to a group of people called the Hadza, and it's 500 people, hunter-gatherers in Tanzania, that until now we've thought that they were a 60,000-year-old genetic isolate, which means they have no common ancestors with anyone else in the world for about 60,000 years. But they were in Morocco, or there's some people that look like them in Morocco like 12,000 years ago, right? So you see that there's just these inexplicable findings that keep on happening, where there's just a lot we don't know about the past. And it's not surprising, right? We only know about it if some bones happen to get preserved in a cave. But so I think that what we're seeing is that our ancestors traveled far more than we thought. And additionally, like one thing that I should add is to the way we talk about, like if you're going to talk about race and like where you come from, you have to choose a time, right? And interestingly, no one chooses like now. No one chooses their grandparents, right? So no one says I'm American because my grandparents came from from that, like my grandparents were born here, right? I mean, if you're Black, you're talking about your ancestry from like 300 years ago, right? You're ignoring the current, like the last what, 5, 6, 7 generations, and you're saying I'm Black because I'm from Africa and my ancestors were there at some point in time, right? So okay, you can find out where your ancestors were 1,000 years ago, and that's also sort of what we do. And it is weird that we sort of fix this point in time, and A, we're kind of sloppy about it, but B, it's also like, why is this point in time fixed? So, for example, if you're French, we know that the French were Gauls, right? So we know that they were in Germany 2,000 years ago. But the French don't have any pride for being like from some place, yeah, what is it, 800 miles northeast of France. They're French, right? Because to them, again, they say, okay, I'm French because my ancestors have been French, for a long time. And even before they were Gauls, they were probably in the Near East. And before that, they're probably in somewhere in like East Africa, because, of course, all humans do probably come from like somewhere in Africa. Like that's pretty much agreed upon. But yet we have to choose a time, right? So the reason we choose 1,000 years ago or so, I mean, I haven't actually asked someone who really cares about that, but I think the reason why we kind of picked that time is we think, okay, we didn't have big ships, we didn't have planes. So wherever your ancestors were 1,000 years ago, they were also there for the last 8,000 years before that. And that's why it makes sense, but that's not true. So that's sort of the big thing, right? Like, sure, you could also fix where they were 100 years ago. You could choose 1,000, you could choose 2,000. Of course, the farther back you go, the you can't be as sure. But the idea of having an ancestry for most people is really a question of where were the majority of my ancestors 1,000 years ago. And then if that's totally different than 2,000 years ago, and that's totally different than 3,000 years ago, then it's kind of what's the point? Because the reason why we don't do where your ancestors were 100 years ago is because we know it's not the same, especially in this country, right? In like the US, where your ancestors were 100 years ago is, I mean, for probably the majority of people, is not where they were 500 years ago. So it doesn't matter, right? That's not ancestry. That's just travel. That's like migration. But I don't think there exists a time of stability. That's my big point, right? I don't think that exists. So it's maybe in the new world, maybe like, so to give those people a bone, I'll say, yeah, maybe if you're a Native American, you can be pretty confident that 3,000 years ago, your ancestors were probably in the Americas. So maybe a little bit, but for the most part, I don't think this is a useful conception to rewind 1,000 years and say where my ancestors were then really matters. Because if they were there then they were there for the previous, 10,000 or 5,000 years. I think what we're seeing is that's not true.